Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Early voting begins, a new study on the aquifer, and much more. Tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined this week by a roundtable of journalists, starting with Toby Sells, news editor, the Memphis Flyer. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Eric.
Madeline Faber is editor with High Ground News. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Karanja Janaku, editor of the New Tri-State Defender. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be here.
And Bill Dries is senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. We'll start with early voting and primary voting and all that. And Bill, why don't you give us a rundown of everything that's on the ballot, and we'll kind of talk through some of the dynamics and so on of this upcoming election day.
All right, this is the election cycle that has the county general election. Most, virtually all, but not every single one of the Shelby County government offices on the ballot to be decided who starts their term of office September 1st. Then you have the state and federal primary elections. This is all 14 of our state house members, 3 of our 5 state senators. You also have, of course, the primary races for governor, and then you have the federal primaries, which are for all of our congressional seats, and the U.S. Senate seat currently held by Bob Corker. And then you have 2, in effect, special things on the ballot just for fun. You have a special race for a Memphis City Council seat that came vacant, and you have a referendum question about how pay raises are determined for the county mayor and the county sheriff. And we should also say that 4 of the races on your county general election ballot are special races for judicial vacancies.
And so, Karanja, there've been probably the most attention has been on, I would say, the county mayor's race, at least locally, right? I mean, between Lee Harris, current state senator, and David Lenore, who's a Republican, Lee Harris being a Democrat. David Lenore, what will be the outgoing trustee, Shelby County trustee. Your thoughts on how that race is shaping up, especially as early voting has started?
I think that when we first started, a lot of people thought that it might be somewhat of a runaway in terms of Lenore and the amount of money that he had behind him. I think from the beginning, I think people thought that Mr. Harris was someone who could handle himself relative to the quality of the debate, and that certainly has proved to be the case. It seemed to me that in the last couple of weeks, in terms of the anecdotal information that I'm hearing, that there are more people who think that Mr. Harris really has a serious shot at winning this, the money notwithstanding. I think part of it has been the way that he has handled himself, and also some of what some people might say missteps on the part of the Lenore campaign.
You also have very much the Democratic Party's new energy in the wake of Donald Trump's election as president in 2016. Let's remember that Shelby County was a county that Hillary Clinton carried by a very substantial margin in the 2016 presidential general election. The Democratic Party's charter was actually abolished here by the state party in 2016. The party has now reformed.
Abolished because of a whole lot of missteps and accusations of real bad doings.
Yeah, years of dysfunction. So the new local Democratic Party that has been formed is a lot of new blood, a lot of new ideas, and a lot of energy that's there. The Republicans have their own energy, have a different kind of energy that I think comes from a different place too. Not to mention a very successful record in the last 2 county elections.
And go ahead, Carl.
Well, I think that it'll be interesting to see if that sort of energy that is moving the Democratic Party, the millennials, if those millennials then vote, because historically that has been an issue.
Particularly at the local level, these things don't translate. People don't understand. They might vote for Barack Obama. They might vote for George Bush, whatever that national race, but does it translate down into the locals? Go ahead.
For all of the talk about what the May County primaries meant in that regard, this election is probably the first real test of how much that energy translates from talking about it to actually going out there and affecting races on the ballot.
And then that translates into potentially, I mean, you've got almost somewhat surprisingly, you're going to have a competitive race for the Senate seat. Back to what I think what Bill said about the President Trump and the frustration among Democrats about that election. So Phil Bredesen, the two-term governor, Democratic governor, is suddenly very competitive statewide. So that could drive some amount of turnout. You've also got a governor's race on the Republican side, and I don't know who wants to take that in terms of Randy Boyd, Bill Lee, Diane Black, Beth Harwell. I know I'm leaving someone out. Randy Boyd, did I say?
Those are the four major.
The four major Republicans who are fighting it out. I mean, it's hard to turn on the TV and not see an ad for one of them calling the other person not a true conservative, or words to that effect.
And that's what will probably drive Republican turnout to a higher level than we saw in the May County primary election. The Bredesen and Blackburn, Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn is the presumptive Republican nominee. They're both on the, she and Bredesen are on the ballot in primary contest.
Fair enough.
But for all practical purposes, they're already in the general election campaign. They're already running against each other and heading for the actual vote on the November ballot.
And it'll be interesting, Carl. I mean, with such a heated governor's race on the Republican side, that will turn out Republican votes. And it would, I mean, off the cuff, it would be hard to believe that many people voting for any four of those very conservative Republican candidates would also vote for Lee Harris. I mean, he's not sort of a particularly crossover candidate, I don't think, to that group. But maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I don't know. He might have more crossover than you think.
Okay.
I mean, I think that the way he has conducted himself relative to his time in the state Senate would suggest that he might have more traction than we think. He certainly pitches himself as being someone who has the capacity and the ability to be able to reach. He says his message is such that it has cross-party appeal.
Let me say just one more minute on this, so that we move forward. One is, what is the status? There was a lawsuit about early voting sites. What happened there, Bill, and is there a resolution?
These were actually a pair of lawsuits that wound up in Chancery Court, and the issue was the addition of 5 new early voting sites, actually another one at Election Commission offices, for a total of 27. Normally we have 21. The Election Commission added 5. 3 of them were in Republican-dominated areas, and the one site that's open early, they call it early voting. Yes, that's how involved.
We've used a lot of interesting phrases today.
We did.
We're only 7 minutes into the show.
Only in the world of politics. but the one site that opened at the outset of early voting for it was supposed to be the first 4 days of it, was moved from downtown to Agra Center. So the lawsuit was that alleged that this was an attempt, whether the intent was there or not, that the actual effect of this was to suppress the African American vote. And the Chancellor Joe D. Jenkins ruled that that was in fact what he thought was happening here. And for the first time in the 24-year history of early voting in Shelby County, he actually intervened and said, no, this is how the early voting is going to work. This is where it's going to be. And so we're now in the early voting period until July 28th.
Okay, so early voting through the 28th, and then election, I've lost track.
Elections
day,
on August 2nd.
August 2nd. Last thoughts on the early voting lawsuit and how that played out?
Well, he's right that some people did argue that it was a move to disenfranchise inner city voters. And I think the other thing that was important there, Bill, was that the chancellor seemed to indicate some concern about whether the open meetings law have been
violated. Okay. We'll move on now to the aquifer and a study that came out that Toby, you are going to be writing about and that you've taken a look at. You've obviously been covering, I think we've all been covering to some degree the aquifer, but you all have done a whole lot of work on that. Talk about this new study.
The study that came out, it was last week, is the final report from the United States Geological Survey and the University of Memphis on the aquifer situation close to TVA's new energy plant out there. There's a coal ash pond there, and around that they found high levels of toxins. Folks were afraid that water from there was getting down into the shallower Mississippi River Valley alluvial aquifer, and then the Memphis Sand Aquifer is below that. Folks were afraid if TVA ran their wells out there that some of those toxins could leak down into our drinking water. TVA stopped their plan with the wells. They said, let's investigate this. They hired these firms to do this work. And then when they found the toxins, they said, we're not going to use those wells. Instead, we're going to build big tanks out there, use MLGW wastewater to cool them, and that's how they've gone on from there. The final study came last week and found that there is indeed those two aquifers, the shallow one and the Memphis sand, they're hydraulically linked, which just means that there is a chance that those waters could mingle. And in fact, the study found that in the past those waters have mingled. But experts I talked to said that there's not a big chance yet that our drinking water is unsafe or in danger, but environmental folks are really worried that that could happen down the road.
And it has been interesting, and I've mentioned it before, I'll mention it again. It was when this aquifer issue came up and we all started talking about it. I mean, prior to that, most people thought we have great drinking water and we have this great aquifer, even if they didn't necessarily know what that aquifer was. And it was in part, for me, a series of stories you all did in the Tri-State Defender about all the implications of clean drinking water, what it meant, likening to what happened in Flint, Michigan, when they moved some things around with their water system, and Flint lost its drinking water, and it had to be brought in. And so water, sometimes we do take it for granted, but then you look around at places from Flint, Michigan to Atlanta that has had huge assaults, or I guess environmental assaults on its water sources. California, which has been in drought conditions for decades. It's an interesting issue beyond just that hits us at home, hits us industrially, hits us at the neighborhood level.
It is interesting. It's important. It's important for us as journalists to know that and not to shy away from it, thinking that people aren't interested in it. And then it's incumbent upon us to find engaging ways to write about it. You know, so I really admire what you've been doing there.
And Bill, what happened? A couple of things that we've talked about that I've lost track of, honestly, and as we were getting ready for the show. The whole issue of permitting for wells, and it might be you or Toby a question, that really there was a point in time where you could just pretty much go, put a well, drill a well into the aquifer without permission from anyone. Have those rules changed, or is that still the case? You don't know.
There are still some rules that there are proposals for changing those rules, and there's much discussion about it. And the reason there's much discussion is because of what happened here. TVA did those wells, and it's hard to overestimate the impact of the finding of the significant lead levels in that ash pond by the old Allen steam plant. The president of TVA, when he came here, said that finding changed really everything in regard to what was a $1 billion plant that they built and recently opened there.
We'll move on now to residential development and residential pilots, which are pilots of any form tend to be fairly controversial, and we talk about a lot on this show because of their impact and so on. But also this whole question, so we'll talk about residential pilot. Toby did a really interesting story for the Flyer on infill development. And we've got, big residential development going in on Broad Avenue, right, in Binghamton. And the mayor having said, in part because of all this real estate development and other things, the quote was something, "We need to become the next IT city," Strickland said. Madeline, when you think about all this residential development that's going on, a lot of times we tend to focus on what's happening maybe in downtown or just in midtown, but there's a lot going on in other neighborhoods as well. Much of it for good, and some of it there's some question marks.
So I think when we talk about residential pilots, we need to look really critically about who these pilots benefit. I mean, with a traditional economic development pilot, at least it creates jobs, almost immediately. That provides an immediate benefit to us. Residential pilot, I think, seems like it's going to help mostly, a handful of local developers who are going to do their projects anyway. They've been holding on to the land forever. And I'm also concerned about, we're calling it a pilot, right? It's only around for 10 projects. 10 projects is huge. I mean, that has the capacity to be absolutely monumental and totally.
The average project so far has been $20, $40 million, I think.
Right. And the Broad project is over 400 units. I mean, that's enormous. Like, that's just flooding an area that is not densely residential with very, very dense residential capacity. And so I think, we all know that Midtown is hitting a tipping point. Toby wrote this excellent cover story about it that we're going to get to. And we know that tipping point's approaching. I don't know why we need to throw kerosene on the development necessarily, when there are so many other neighborhoods outside of the city core that would really benefit from, if we have to throw tax incentives at housing, at all. I think we should be focusing on building up Memphis neighborhoods. I mean, Whitehaven is a strong neighborhood. It's got 50,000 residents, but really old housing stock and big houses too, like 4 or 5 bedroom homes.
And a whole lot of development, investment going into the Graceland area,
right,
into the hotel there and so on.
But there's nowhere for young professionals to move back. I mean, there aren't any new nice apartments, out in Memphis neighborhoods. And I think that these neighborhoods, which are already kind of lie outside of our central consciousness, when we think about development in Memphis, are at risk of becoming less relevant if we're not reinvesting in housing for the next generation to consider these neighborhoods in Memphis truly.
Talk about your cover story and respond to what Madeline said.
Absolutely, and I think talking with people out there, a lot of different people, there's pilot fatigue in this city, and not only for big maybe industrial projects, but residential projects as well. People are just wondering what we're getting, and there's a sense out there that the recession is over for people. There are new requirements for TennCare benefits and other government benefits for regular folks. But the recession's not over for these developers out there. We're still, like you said, throwing kerosene on this thing that is mighty, mighty hot. And that was kind of the beginning of my cover story about infill development, is that Memphis is a hot market right now. You look at home prices, you look at home values, you look at home sales, they're going through the roof. And developers see that and they are moving in. And we have got housing developments happening all over the city, like the one on Broad Avenue. And instead of finding an empty place and building something brand new there, they're either going in, renovating someplace, or they're tearing something down and building something new on the spot. That's kind of what infill development is.
And we've also heard over and over again this argument that, yeah, we don't like the pilots, but you have to have them to compete. By the same token, though, I've heard, I won't name him because it was an informal conversation, but the head of a group that's doing some major things in one part of the city has basically told me what I think is a common philosophy among the developers, and that is, well, yeah, there's competition among the developers, and our competition in terms of the developers are applying for these pilots. So our philosophy is, why aren't we trying to get it too? We may not necessarily need it. It would make financing easier, but if our competition is going for it, we're certainly going to get in line for it as well.
Well, I think part of the pilot fatigue also is that some people are saying that it's too narrow of a way to look at what economic development is. That it's more than just offering tax incentives, that people are arguing that we should follow what they call the Amazon plan, right? Where we need a quality university, that has a strong tech focus, that has, we need quality transportation, the quality workforce, we need an attractive city environment, and then the tax incentives. And so I think part of the frustration is that, hey, look, we talk about economic development and we seem to focus in so much tunnel vision on the tax incentive part of it. And then also you have people like Community Lift, Eric Robertson, and those guys are saying that we really need to re-examine this idea of what do we mean about economic development. And I know that they're involved in a study now that will come out that will look at some of the other cities and what they're doing relative to economic development. It's sort of on a parallel track with the study that the Greater Memphis Chamber is doing also.
Right.
And I'll come back to you, Bill, and I will put myself in the awkward position of defending the developers against everything that was just said, which is not necessarily my personal opinion, but I know there are people watching and developers and others who are in favor of these incentives, people at the city, people at the chamber, and so on, who will say, look, some of these pieces of land, for instance, the Broad Avenue piece of land, which is owned by Bob Loeb, who's done a lot of development around town, he's owned that warehouse since the 90s. It's a pretty low tax contributor. There isn't a whole lot of economic impact that is associated with that warehouse. There will be both from the construction that goes into it, and then all those people who move there, and then the tax. They will be paying taxes. It's not a tax. It's a tax break, but it's not that they don't pay taxes going forward on the apartments that will be built, and that there'll be all this economic impact that comes from those people living there, and that they will also say that because Memphis and Shelby County is a double taxation city, where you're paying a pretty high rate at the city level and a pretty high rate at the the county level, without those tax incentives, it's not cost advantageous to develop within the city. That they'll just go out to Germantown, they'll go out to Bartlett, they'll go out to Arlington and put their dollars there. Now, is that my opinion? I'm not saying that's my opinion, but I do want to kind of balance out that is the argument that they make. And the city makes the argument too that what Memphis needs in order to get to transportation the transportation we need and some of the things we need that that Amazon was looking for when it was trying to find a second headquarters is more density. So that, multifamily brings in density. Infill developments in neighborhoods brings in density. It puts more people per square foot, and that is worth the tax incentives to make that happen as well. Again, not my opinion, but just to channel the other side of the argument.
Well, I can follow that, but I think that some people would say, look, we're not saying throw out tax incentives, but they're saying we should have more oversight when we go about doing tax incentives. And so when you look at the broad development and the Thrive development, I mean, I think some of the question is, did we need to give them the amount of tax abatement that we did?
Yeah. Bill, you were going to.
I think too that this is not really so much about where developers choose to do these projects as it is about kind of setting the stage for this kind of development. Eric Robertson with Community Lift has talked about how, okay, a plant or an apartment complex the developers want to build it in some area. Well, where is the coordinated effort around that to deal with housing if it's a plant of some kind? Where is the total plan for that, as opposed to just saying, yeah, go ahead and build that and somehow organically all of the rest of the things that we want with it in terms of a community will come and will happen? Well, I think we've got a pretty good example of the difficulty in doing that with what happened at Legends Park, and everybody said, okay, well, Bonner's going to
one of the big housing projects that was torn down and rebuilt in more the new style of mixed income development.
And I can remember the city officials involved in it saying, yeah, we've got it made. This is going to happen automatically because the new Le Bonheur Children's Medical Center has moved right there on the corner directly across from it. So the future is assured of this area. It's not that easy.
Yeah, and again, channeling my inner city official, they would say that Memphis 3.0 is going to try to address that, the overall strategic plan for the city, where they're going neighborhood by neighborhood and person by person and trying to put those mix of decisions and not just look at developments in isolation, and that development can't stop while we wait for 3.0 to be done. Again, not necessarily my opinion, but I know that is something people on the other side of this would bring up. I'm gonna just go ahead and say awkwardly that we'll shift to another bit of news this week, which was and I'm so uncomfortable bringing this up, but I will because we talked about it before the show, which is the Daily Memphian. And so a new news source that's being launched in the city of Memphis that I am involved with and will be president and executive editor of it. The editorial staff of the Daily News is coming over, Bill Dries most certainly, and others. Ask me a question rather than me making a statement. I don't, you know what I'm saying? And we did a press conference this week, and Toby wrote a story. I think you did, or you were there, and I believe Madeline wrote a story. So anyway, ask me a question. It'd be easier than me
And I
talking.
believe Madeline, in fact, is involved in this as well.
Okay. So I should say too that So this new effort, which will be a newsroom of about 25 people, covering an online news source. Also, we're partnering up with High Ground. Madeline will actually be in the newsroom and working together on stories and the really interesting stuff they're doing. Chalkbeat, which avid viewers of the show know Laura Faith Cabetta, who's on the show sometimes. Cynthia Jones, who is the Tennessee bureau chief, and another person whose name I just forgot. They'll all be contributing to it. Back sadly, and I don't even know how long it's been before, Burnell Smith, the former publisher of the Tri-State Defender, he and I had talked about beginning to work together in some fashion, and we'll be working with other people and as we go forward. So.
Eric,
ask a question.
Where did the idea for the new news source come from?
So what happened was, as Gannett is cut back, and let me say this too about Gannett. Ryan Poe, who works for the Commercial Appeal and others from the Commercial Appeal, Ryan just couldn't be here today, and they will be invited to this show. So there's no animosity whatsoever towards Commercial Appeal. I think people wanted a Memphis-focused, news source that was covering everything in Memphis in a way that they felt it wasn't be covering. And people were coming to me kind of somewhat anecdotally, coming to me very formally, and finally people with looking to invest and to spend money came and said, what could we do? And so it's been a sort of 2-year conversation and then really a 1-year conversation that was very, very serious. And then sometime in the spring, we settled on a business model. It'll be a nonprofit entity. Money has been donated anonymously from multiple donors, no strings attached. There's a very public board that is on the website or will be on the website very soon. And that's who controls it, and we'll have editorial independence from that.
But as you said, the kind of the business model, the paywall is going to be integral to that. You're not just going to go donation to donation. Maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah. So we had this whole thing where we weren't ready to announce, so people started speculating. So we kind of announced when we weren't quite ready to announce. The Twitter was all messed up anyway. But we needed to get the word out there. We are not going to be purely donation based. We have basically seed money to start. It'll be a paywall driven website. It will have sponsorships and so on. And our goal is to be a sustainable nonprofit within 4 to 5 years, and continue to kind of grow and evolve and so on.
I don't have a question, but I think the thing that's encouraging is that you're coming into the city with the idea of really adding to our substantive level of coverage.
And we will leave it there because we're out of time. But thanks for joining us. Join us again next week.